Still clipping coupons, Helen? My daughter-in-law Vanessa asked with a laugh that carried across the dining room table. A few people smiled. A few looked down at their plates. My son Ryan kept eating as if he hadn't heard a thing. I smiled too. Not because it was funny, but because after 68 years of life, I had learned that the people who underestimate you often reveal more about themselves than they realize. I'm Helen Parker, and if you had looked at me that evening, you probably would have believed every assumption Vanessa had made. I drove a 12-year-old sedan with faded paint. I lived in a modest one-bedroom apartment on the edge of town. I bought store-brand groceries and saved every receipt. To most people, I looked like a woman struggling to get by. That dinner was supposed to be a family celebration. Ryan and Vanessa had invited relatives and friends to show off the home they had purchased 3 years earlier in a newly developed neighborhood outside Columbus, Ohio. The house was large, nearly 3,000 square feet, with tall windows, a stone fireplace, and a backyard deck that overlooked a small pond. Vanessa loved giving tours. She walked guests from room to room, pointing out imported light fixtures, custom cabinets, and expensive furniture. Every compliment seemed to make her stand a little taller. "We worked hard for all of this," she said proudly for what felt like the 10th time that night. I nodded politely. The truth was that I had always been proud of Ryan. I remembered the little boy who used to ride his bicycle up and down our street until the porch lights came on. After my husband George passed away 8 years earlier, Ryan became more distant. At first, I blamed grief. Then I blamed work. Eventually, I stopped looking for excuses. Vanessa returned from the kitchen carrying a tray of desserts. "Helen," she said sweetly, "I almost bought you a gift card for one of those budget grocery stores you like. Then I figured you probably already know all their best deals." A few nervous chuckles floated through the room. Ryan stared at his glass. He never told her to stop. That hurt more than the joke itself. I took a sip of iced tea and kept my expression calm. The room smelled of vanilla candles and fresh paint. Outside, the sun was setting over the pond, casting golden reflections across the water. It should have been a peaceful evening. Instead, I felt like a guest at a performance where everyone already knew the script except me. As dinner continued, conversations drifted from vacations to investments to rising home values. Vanessa seemed particularly interested in discussing money. "Property taxes are getting ridiculous," she complained. "Honestly, people who don't own homes have no idea how expensive real life can be." Her eyes flickered toward me. The message was clear. Then something unexpected happened. Vanessa stepped into the hallway to answer a phone call. A few minutes later, Ryan followed her. I wasn't trying to listen. I simply happened to be carrying my empty plate toward the kitchen when I heard their voices through the partially open laundry room door. "How much time do we have?" Ryan asked quietly. "Not much," Vanessa replied. "The bank already sent the final notice." I froze. "We just need another few months," Ryan said. "If they move forward, we lose everything." My hand tightened around the plate. The bank? Final notice? Lose everything? A moment later, footsteps approached, and I continued walking before either of them noticed me. Back at the table, I sat down and smiled as if nothing had happened. Vanessa returned wearing her usual confident expression. Ryan laughed at a joke someone made. The evening carried on, but something had changed. For the first time all night, I stopped wondering why they looked down on me. Instead, I started wondering what they were so desperate to hide. I did not sleep much that night. After I returned to my apartment, I sat by the kitchen window with a cup of chamomile tea and watched the lights of passing cars move through the darkness. The conversation I had overheard kept replaying in my mind. The bank, a final notice, losing everything. For years, Ryan and Vanessa had worked very hard to convince everyone that their lives were perfect. Their social media pages were filled with vacation photos, expensive restaurants, and smiling family portraits. Yet behind those carefully chosen pictures, something was clearly falling apart. The next morning, I followed my usual routine. I woke up at 6 o'clock, watered the small plants on my balcony, and drove to the grocery store a few miles away. I bought only what I needed: fresh fruit, milk, bread, and a few vegetables. The cashier greeted me by name. I had shopped there for years. It was a simple life, but it was peaceful. As I pushed my car through the parking lot, I thought about how differently Ryan viewed me now. When he was younger, he used to admire my ability to stretch every dollar. After George and I bought our first house, we spent years saving carefully. We repaired things instead of replacing them. We planned ahead. We understood that appearances could be expensive. Somewhere along the way, Ryan forgot those lessons. Or perhaps Vanessa convinced him they no longer mattered. Around noon, my phone rang. It was Ryan. That alone surprised me. He rarely called unless there was a holiday or family gathering. "Hi, Mom," he said. His voice sounded tired. "Just checking in." I smiled sadly. Ryan had never been a convincing actor. "That is nice of you," I replied. There was a pause. "How have you been?" he asked. "The same as always," I said. "Quiet. Comfortable." Another pause followed. It felt as though he wanted to say something else, but could not find the words. Finally, he changed the subject and ended the call a few minutes later. When I set the phone down, I knew one thing for certain. Something was weighing heavily on him. That afternoon, I stopped by the local library. George and I used to visit every Saturday. Even now, walking between the shelves made me feel close to him. On my way out, I noticed a real estate magazine sitting near the entrance. Normally, I would not have paid attention to it. This time, however, I picked it up. The cover featured articles about mortgage rates, refinancing, and foreclosure trends. The word caught my attention immediately. Foreclosure. I carried the magazine home and spent the evening reading. The more I learned, the more concerned I became. Missing payments could trigger warnings. Warnings could become notices. Notices could eventually lead to auctions. Suddenly, the pieces I had overheard began fitting together. Late that evening, I opened my laptop and searched public property records. I hesitated before typing Ryan's address. Part of me felt guilty. Another part remembered every joke, every dismissive comment, every moment I had been treated like an embarrassment. A few seconds later, the property record appeared on the screen. My heart sank. Several financial filings had been recorded over the previous months. I stared at the dates in silence. Whatever problems Ryan and Vanessa were facing, they were not new. They had been hiding them for a long time. And for the first time, I began to suspect that the house everyone admired might not belong to them much longer. For the next several days, I told no one what I had found. I continued living exactly as I always had. I drove my old sedan. I visited the grocery store. I attended church on Sunday morning and shared coffee with a few longtime friends afterward. From the outside, nothing had changed. Inside, however, I was paying attention in a way I had not before. The following weekend, Ryan and Vanessa hosted another gathering at their house. It was smaller than the previous one, just a few neighbors and friends from work. I almost declined the invitation, but curiosity convinced me to go. The moment I arrived, I noticed something different. The confidence that usually surrounded Vanessa seemed forced. Her smile appeared a little too practiced. Ryan looked exhausted. Dark circles rested beneath his eyes, and he checked his phone so often that several conversations ended before they even started. The house still looked impressive. The polished hardwood floors reflected the afternoon sunlight. The kitchen counters were spotless. Fresh flowers sat in expensive glass vases. Yet once you knew where to look, small cracks became visible. A stack of unopened envelopes sat near the front hallway. Vanessa quickly moved them when she noticed me glancing in that direction. During lunch, a neighbor complimented the backyard renovation. Vanessa laughed and launched into another story about property values rising in the neighborhood. Everyone nodded politely. Then one of the guests mentioned higher interest rates. For a brief second, Ryan's expression changed. It was gone almost immediately, but I saw it. Worry. Real worry. Later that afternoon, I stepped outside onto the deck overlooking the pond. The water was calm, disturbed only by a pair of ducks moving across the surface. Ryan joined me a few moments later. We stood in silence for a while. It reminded me of when he was young and would sit beside me after a difficult day at school. Back then, silence meant trust. Now it felt different. "Everything okay?" I asked gently. He stared toward the water. "Sure," he replied too quickly. I nodded. "You know you do not have to pretend with me." He smiled weakly. "I am fine, Mom." The conversation ended there, but his answer told me everything. People who are truly fine rarely need to insist that they are. As I prepared to leave that evening, I passed through the kitchen and overheard another brief exchange. Vanessa was speaking in a low voice. "We cannot keep doing this," she said. "Something has to happen before next month." Ryan rubbed his forehead. "I know." They fell silent when they saw me. I acted as though I had heard nothing. Back at home, I sat at my desk and opened the property records again. This time I searched more carefully. Additional filings had appeared. The situation was moving faster than I expected. I leaned back in my chair and thought about George. My husband had always believed that financial problems rarely appeared overnight. They started with small decisions. Then came pride. Then denial. Eventually reality arrived, whether people were ready for it or not. As I closed the laptop, my eyes landed on an old photograph sitting beside the lamp. George stood beside me in front of our first house, both of us smiling despite the peeling paint and tiny front porch. We had built our life slowly, one careful step at a time. Looking at that photograph, I suddenly remembered something George had told me years ago. At the time, it seemed unimportant. Now it returned with surprising clarity. And for the first time, I wondered whether my late husband had left behind more than memories. The memory stayed with me all night. George had been sitting at our kitchen table years earlier, reviewing a stack of papers while drinking black coffee from his favorite mug. I remembered asking why he spent so much time organizing documents that nobody ever seemed to use. He had smiled and tapped the folder with one finger. Because someday, Helen, knowing where things are will matter more than people realize. At the time, I laughed and told him he worried too much. George simply smiled. Looking back, I understood that he rarely worried without a reason. The next morning, I pulled a small storage box from the back of my bedroom closet. It contained old photographs, greeting cards, insurance documents, and files that I had not touched in years. Dust covered the lid. I carried it to the dining table and began sorting through everything one piece at a time. Hours passed quietly. Outside, a light rain tapped against the windows. Inside, memories filled the room. There were photographs from family vacations, school pictures of Ryan, and anniversary cards George had saved for decades. Then I found a manila folder with George's handwriting on the front. My heart skipped. His handwriting was unmistakable, neat, precise, organized. I opened the folder carefully. Inside were account statements, correspondence, and notes dating back many years. At first, none of it made sense. The names of companies were unfamiliar. Some documents referenced investments I did not remember discussing. Others contained figures that seemed surprisingly large. I spent the afternoon reading every page. Slowly, a picture began to emerge. George had been investing for decades. Not recklessly, not dramatically, quietly, consistently. Small amounts at first, then larger ones as time passed. He had never talked about it because he disliked showing off. In fact, he often said that real security was something you felt, not something you displayed. As evening approached, I found a business card tucked between two documents. The name printed on it stopped me cold. Daniel Brooks. I knew that name. Daniel had been one of George's closest friends for years. A real estate attorney. We had not spoken since George's funeral. I stared at the card for a long moment before picking up my phone. The number was still active. Daniel answered on the third ring. His voice sounded older, but immediately familiar. "Helen," he said with genuine surprise. "It has been a long time." We spoke for nearly an hour. At first we shared memories about George. Then I mentioned the folder. Silence followed. Not uncomfortable silence. Thoughtful silence. Finally Daniel spoke. "George always hoped you would find those documents if you ever needed them." I felt my pulse quicken. Needed them for what? I asked. Daniel exhaled slowly. "There are things your husband arranged that we should discuss in person." The room suddenly felt very still. I looked at the stack of papers spread across my table. "Are you telling me there is more?" I asked. "Much more," Daniel replied. We agreed to meet later that week at his office downtown. After ending the call, I sat quietly beside the window as the rain continued falling outside. For the first time since overhearing Ryan and Vanessa's conversation, I was no longer focused entirely on their problems. Instead, I found myself wondering what George had spent years building without anyone knowing. And deep down, I had a feeling that whatever Daniel was about to tell me would change everything. 3 days later, I drove downtown to meet Daniel Brooks. His office occupied the second floor of a brick building that had stood there for decades. The furniture was older than most modern offices, but everything was spotless and carefully maintained. It reminded me of George. Practical, reliable. Daniel greeted me warmly and led me into a conference room overlooking the courthouse square. A large folder rested on the table between us. The moment I saw it, I knew this meeting was going to be important. Daniel sat down and folded his hands. "Before we begin," he said, "there is something George made me promise." I felt my chest tighten slightly. "What was it?" Daniel smiled. He said that if the day ever came when you needed to understand everything, I was to show you the full picture. Not part of it, all of it. He opened the folder and slowly turned it toward me. Inside were documents, account summaries, investment records, and legal agreements. I stared at the numbers. Then I stared again because I was convinced I had misread them. The total value was far beyond anything I had imagined. George had built a substantial investment portfolio over many years. Not through risky speculation, not through luck, through patience, consistency, discipline. Small investments had grown into larger ones. Properties had appreciated. Dividends had been reinvested. The process had continued quietly for decades. "This cannot be right," I whispered. Daniel nodded. "It is right." I looked down at the papers again. My hands trembled slightly. For years I had lived modestly, because that was how George and I had always lived. We never measured success by appearance. We measured it by stability. Yet even I had never realized the full extent of what he had built. Daniel pointed to another section of the file. George also created a trust structure several years before he passed away. My eyes followed the page. There it was in black and white. Beneficiary, Helen Parker. Sole beneficiary. I sat back in my chair. For several moments, neither of us spoke. The sounds of traffic drifted faintly through the windows. Finally, I laughed softly. Not because anything was funny, because the truth felt almost unbelievable. "Ryan has no idea, does he?" I asked. Daniel shook his head. "No. George specifically requested that these arrangements remain private unless you chose otherwise." A memory surfaced. Years ago, Ryan had teased George about driving an old pickup truck long after he could have afforded something newer. George had simply smiled and changed the subject. Now I understood why. He never cared what people assumed about him. Daniel continued explaining the investments, the accounts, and the legal protections George had established. By the end of the meeting, one fact stood above everything else. I was financially secure, more secure than I had ever imagined. Yet instead of feeling triumphant, I felt thoughtful. My mind drifted back to Ryan and Vanessa, their expensive dinners, their constant need to impress people, their growing financial problems, their jokes at my expense. As if reading my thoughts, Daniel slid another document across the table. "There is one more thing you should know." I looked down. It referenced a public foreclosure proceeding scheduled within the coming weeks. The address was immediately familiar. Ryan and Vanessa's house. My eyes moved slowly across the page. A date had already been set. The process was further along than I realized. Daniel watched quietly as I finished reading. "What are you going to do?" he asked. I stared at the document for a long moment. Then I carefully closed the folder. Outside, the afternoon sun reflected off the courthouse windows. Inside, a plan had not yet formed. But for the first time, I knew something they did not. The future they feared was approaching much faster than they realized. After my meeting with Daniel, I made a decision that surprised even me. I was not going to rush in and rescue anyone. For years, I had stepped forward whenever Ryan needed help. I had loaned money when he was younger. I had provided childcare when his schedule became overwhelming. I had listened when life became difficult. Yet somewhere along the way, my support had transformed into something expected rather than appreciated. This time, I wanted to see what happened when I simply remained quiet. The following weeks passed slowly. Autumn settled across Ohio. The trees lining my apartment complex turned shades of gold and red. Cooler air arrived in the mornings. I continued my routines exactly as before. Every Tuesday, I visited the farmer's market. Every Thursday, I met a friend for coffee. Every Sunday, I attended church. Outwardly, nothing about my life suggested that I possessed information capable of changing several futures. Meanwhile, signs of strain around Ryan and Vanessa became impossible to ignore. Vanessa posted less frequently online. The photographs that once appeared almost daily became occasional updates. When she did share something, the smile seemed forced. Ryan called me more often, although our conversations remained brief. He never mentioned money directly. Instead, he asked small questions. How was I feeling? Did I need anything? Was everything going well? Beneath every question, I sensed another one he could not bring himself to ask. One evening, Ryan invited me to dinner. The atmosphere inside the house felt different from previous visits. The expensive decorations remained. The furniture remained. The polished image remained. But the energy had changed. Anxiety seemed to linger in every room. During dinner, Vanessa barely touched her food. Ryan looked distracted. At one point, a notification appeared on his phone screen. I noticed his expression tighten before he quickly turned the device face down. Nobody mentioned it. The silence spoke loudly enough. As the meal continued, Vanessa began discussing a neighbor who had recently sold her home. "Some people get lucky," she said. "Sometimes everything just works out for them." There was bitterness in her voice that had not been there before. A year earlier, she would have described success as something earned. Now she sounded like someone hoping for a miracle. I listened quietly. Then she glanced toward me and smiled. "At least simple living has advantages, right, Helen?" The comment was softer than her previous jokes, but the meaning remained familiar. I smiled politely. Peace of mind has always been valuable to me. For a brief moment, neither she nor Ryan responded. On the drive home, I thought about that exchange. Years ago, Vanessa would have viewed my answer as evidence that I lacked ambition. Now I wondered if she understood how much peace of mind was actually worth. A few days later, Daniel called. He informed me that the foreclosure process had officially advanced to the next stage. Public notices had been filed. Dates had been confirmed. Everything was moving according to schedule. After ending the call, I sat quietly in my living room and watched the afternoon sunlight move across the floor. I felt no excitement, no satisfaction, only clarity. Ryan and Vanessa had spent years building a life designed to impress others. Now that structure was beginning to crack under its own weight. And somewhere ahead, a day was approaching that neither of them could avoid. The auction date was now officially set. The morning of the auction arrived with clear skies and unusually cool air. I woke before sunrise and sat quietly with a cup of coffee by my apartment window. Across the parking lot, a few early commuters were already leaving for work. To them, it was an ordinary day. To Ryan and Vanessa, it was anything but ordinary. Over the previous week, Ryan had called me twice. Both conversations felt strained. He sounded exhausted, as though he had not slept well in days. Yet he still never told me the truth about what was happening. He never mentioned the house. He never mentioned the notices. He never mentioned the auction. Part of me wanted to ask directly. Another part wanted to see whether he would trust me enough to be honest on his own. He never did. Around 9 o'clock, I drove downtown. The auction was being held in a county building not far from the courthouse. The parking lot was already filling when I arrived. Men and women carrying folders and briefcases walked toward the entrance. Some were investors. Some represented companies. Others were simply curious observers. I blended in easily. No one paid attention to a 68-year-old woman wearing a modest navy sweater and carrying a simple handbag. Inside, the room felt surprisingly quiet. Rows of chairs faced a small podium at the front. Papers shuffled. People whispered. Phones vibrated occasionally. I found a seat near the middle and waited. A few minutes later, Ryan and Vanessa entered. The sight of them startled me. They looked older than they had only a month earlier. Stress had a way of doing that. Vanessa's usual confidence was gone. Ryan's shoulders slumped as though he were carrying an invisible weight. Neither of them noticed me at first. They sat several rows ahead and spoke quietly to one another. I could not hear the words, but I could see the worry written across their faces. For a brief moment, my heart ached for them. They were still family. Ryan was still my son. No matter how distant we had become, that truth remained. Then another memory surfaced. Vanessa laughing at the dinner table. Ryan saying nothing. The years of assumptions. The years of disrespect. Compassion remained in my heart, but clarity remained as. Well, the proceedings began shortly afterward. One property after another was announced. Bidding started. Numbers rose. Transactions moved quickly. People came and went. Eventually, the address I knew by heart was called. Ryan immediately sat straighter. Vanessa gripped the edge of her chair. The room seemed smaller suddenly. The opening bid was announced. Silence followed for a moment. Then someone across the room raised a paddle. Another bidder joined. The numbers climbed steadily. Ryan lowered his head. Vanessa stared forward without blinking. I could almost feel their hope fading with each increase. Then, at the precise moment I had prepared for, I lifted my bidder card. The auctioneer acknowledged the bid without hesitation. Several heads turned. A few more offers followed. I responded calmly. The bidding continued. Higher, then higher still. Finally, the room grew quiet. The auctioneer looked around one last time. No additional bids appeared. The gavel came down. In that instant, Ryan turned and saw me clearly for the first time that day. His eyes widened. Vanessa looked over her shoulder and froze. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them seemed capable of speaking. As the official paperwork was prepared, one thing became unmistakably clear. The future they had feared had arrived, but the person now standing between them and complete loss was the very woman they had spent years underestimating. The room remained silent long after the auction ended. People gathered their papers and slowly filed toward the exits, but Ryan and Vanessa stayed where they were, frozen by what had just happened. I completed the final signatures with calm hands. Daniel stood nearby, reviewing documents and exchanging a few words with the auction officials. When everything was finished, he handed me a folder and quietly congratulated me. I thanked him and slipped the folder into my handbag. Only then did I turn toward my son. Ryan stood up first. His face carried a mixture of confusion, disbelief, and embarrassment. Vanessa followed a few seconds later. For the first time since I had known her, she seemed completely unsure of what to say. "Mom," Ryan finally said. His voice sounded strained. "What just happened?" I looked at him gently. "The auction happened." He shook his head. "No. I mean, why were you bidding?" Vanessa stared at me as though she expected someone to step forward and explain that this was all a misunderstanding. "How could you even afford that?" she asked before she could stop herself. The question hung in the air. Years earlier, I might have felt offended. Today, I simply felt tired. "Because appearances are not always reality," I replied. None of us spoke for several moments. Then Ryan looked down at the floor. "You knew?" he asked quietly. "You knew about our situation?" I nodded. I knew enough. His shoulders sank. "Why did you not say something?" I thought carefully before answering. "Because every opportunity to tell me the truth was yours, Ryan, not mine." He closed his eyes briefly. I could see the weight of those words settling over him. Outside the building, autumn sunlight reflected off parked cars and courthouse windows. We moved to a quieter area near the entrance where fewer people could overhear. Vanessa folded her arms tightly. Her confidence had disappeared entirely. "So what happens now?" she asked. The question sounded different from the way she usually spoke. There was no sarcasm, no superiority, only uncertainty. I looked at both of them. For years, they had assumed I was struggling financially. They had mistaken simplicity for weakness. They had measured success by houses, cars, vacations, and appearances. They never asked whether I was happy. They never asked whether I was secure. They simply assumed. "What happens now?" I said calmly. "Depends on what you do next." Ryan stared at me. "I do not understand." I opened my handbag and removed one document from the folder. It confirmed the transfer of ownership. The house now belonged to me. Seeing it in writing seemed to make the reality finally sink in. Vanessa's eyes widened. Ryan looked as though he had lost the ability to speak. Yet I felt no satisfaction in their shock. What I felt was disappointment. Not because they had financial problems. Anyone can face hardship. I was disappointed because pride had prevented them from asking for help, and arrogance had convinced them they were somehow above the person who might have understood them best. As we stood there in the cool afternoon air, Ryan looked at me again. This time there was no defensiveness in his expression. No excuses. Only a question he seemed almost afraid to ask. "Mom," he said quietly, "who are you really?" I looked at my son and realized that after all these years, he was only beginning to find out. Ryan's question stayed with me long after we left the courthouse. "Who are you really?" The truth was surprisingly simple. I was the same woman I had always been. The difference was that for years, nobody had bothered to look beyond what they assumed. A week later, I invited Ryan and Vanessa to meet me at the house. The autumn leaves had begun covering the front lawn, and a cool breeze moved through the neighborhood as they arrived. Neither of them looked comfortable. The shock of the auction had faded, but uncertainty remained. We sat around the kitchen table where so many conversations had taken place before. Some had been joyful, others had been difficult. This one would change everything. Ryan looked at me first. "Mom, we owe you an apology." I said nothing and allowed him to continue. "I should have been honest. I should have told you what was happening months ago." His voice was steady but filled with regret. Vanessa lowered her eyes. "I should apologize too," she said quietly. "I said things I never should have said." For a moment, the room became very still. Years earlier, I might have demanded explanations. I might have wanted every hurtful comment addressed one by one. But age teaches different lessons. Some victories come from understanding rather than punishment. I folded my hands on the table. "What matters now is what you learn from this." Neither of them spoke. They listened. Your father spent his entire life teaching one principle. I continued. Do not build your life around impressing people who do not matter. Build your life around stability, honesty, and character. Ryan nodded slowly. I could see memories returning to him. Memories of the man he had once admired. I forgot that, he admitted. Yes, I replied gently. You did. Then I slid a document across the table. Both of them looked down. It outlined a simple agreement. I was not forcing them to leave. I was not selling the house. I was not turning their lives upside down. Instead, they would remain there under specific conditions while rebuilding their finances responsibly. There would be a realistic payment plan, a budget, accountability. Most importantly, there would be honesty. Vanessa looked at me with surprise. You are giving us another chance? She asked. I smiled faintly. I am giving you an opportunity. What you do with it is your choice. Tears filled Ryan's eyes. He quickly looked away. In that moment, I saw the little boy I used to know. Not the exhausted man who had spent years pretending everything was perfect. Just my son. The months that followed were not easy, but they were different. Ryan became more open. Vanessa became more humble. Expensive appearances slowly disappeared from their priorities. They learned how much stress comes from trying to maintain an image and how much peace comes from living within reality. As for me, my life changed very little. I still drove the same old sedan. I still shopped carefully. I still lived simply. The difference was that I no longer felt the need to explain myself to anyone. One spring afternoon, nearly a year later, I sat on the backyard deck overlooking the pond. The same pond where I had once watched Ryan hide his worries behind forced smiles. This time was different. He and Vanessa were laughing together inside the house. Not because they were pretending everything was perfect, but because they were finally building something real. As I watched the sunlight dance across the water, I thought about all the assumptions people make based on appearances. Wealth can be hidden. Struggles can be hidden. Character cannot. In the end, the most valuable thing I gained was not a house. It was the reminder that people who measure your worth by what they see on the surface often miss the truth standing right